The night was wrapped in a hushed stillness, the kind of silence that feels alive, humming beneath the surface with secrets untold. A soft breeze carried the faint fragrance of blooming jasmine through the air, weaving around the dimly lit garden where Emma sat alone on a weathered wooden bench. The glow of the moon bathed her face in silver, softening her sharp features into something almost ethereal. She had always loved the night, not for its darkness, but for the way it gave permission to thoughts that daylight often silenced. Tonight, though, she wasn't lost in her own thoughts. Her gaze kept flickering toward the gravel path that led into the garden, as though she were waiting for someone. Her fingers toyed nervously with the chain around her neck, the locket cool against her skin, until finally, she heard footsteps, steady, confident, but unhurried, as though the man approaching carried no burden of time. When Adrian appeared at the edge of the path, the sight of him stole the breath from her chest. He walked toward her with that familiar half-smile, the one that seemed to exist only for her, and when he sat beside her on the bench, the world felt as if it had finally shifted into place. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty, but full, like the pause before the first notes of a song. Finally, he broke it with a low murmur, "You look like you've been waiting all night." She turned toward him, her lips curving into a small smile, though her voice trembled with honesty. "Maybe I have. Maybe I've been waiting longer than that." Their eyes locked, and in that gaze, there was an unspoken history, shared glances across crowded rooms, fleeting touches that lingered far longer than they should have, words that hovered on the edge of confession but never quite escaped. Tonight felt different. Tonight, under the veil of midnight, the barriers seemed thinner, the risk of truth less frightening. Adrian leaned back, stretching his arm along the back of the bench, his fingers just grazing her shoulder, sending sparks racing down her spine. "You know," he said quietly, his voice soft but steady, "I've always thought the night was made for honesty. There's something about the stars watching over us that makes lies impossible." Emma laughed softly, the sound low and melodic, carrying into the night air like a secret meant only for him. "Then maybe this is the right time," she whispered, her heart pounding. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of her feelings. For the first time, she was ready to let the midnight talk become the beginning of something neither of them would forget. The night seemed to listen as their voices filled the silence, weaving softly into the rhythm of the crickets and the rustling leaves. Adrian turned slightly toward Emma, his eyes tracing her profile as if memorizing it in the moonlight. There was something about her tonight, something different from the countless evenings they had shared in half-spoken words and cautious smiles. Tonight, she wasn't just the woman who sat beside him, but the woman he had dreamed of holding, the woman he had feared to lose to silence. "Tell me," he urged gently, his voice low and coaxing, "what is it you've been waiting to say?" Emma's breath caught, and for a moment, she dropped her gaze to the ground, watching the shadows dance across the gravel. Her fingers tightened on the locket at her throat, and when she finally lifted her eyes again, there was a storm of emotion swimming in them. "I've always been afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling, "afraid of wanting too much, afraid that if I told you how I felt, I would ruin everything we have. But holding it back, it hurts just as much." Adrian's chest tightened at her words, the honesty of them cutting through every wall he had built. He reached for her hand, hesitant at first, but when her fingers curled into his, the hesitation melted away. Their hands fit together as though they had always been meant to, and with that single touch, the distance they had carried between them for so long dissolved. "Emma," he breathed, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin, "you could never ruin what we have. You are what I've been searching for, even when I didn't know I was searching." Her heart fluttered wildly at his confession, the words wrapping around her like a promise. She had dreamed of hearing him say something like this, had replayed imaginary conversations in her head countless times, but the reality was more overwhelming than she had ever dared imagine. Tears glistened in her eyes, but they weren't born of sorrow, they were the tears of someone finally seeing the door to their happiness opening after years of waiting. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "So all this time, you felt it too?" His lips curved into that half-smile again, only softer now, infused with something rawer. "Every moment. Every glance. Every time I heard your laugh, I wanted to be the reason it never stopped. Every time you looked away, I wanted to reach out and make sure you never had to hide from me. I've loved you quietly, patiently, Waiting for a night like this. The words seemed to hang in the air, glowing brighter than the stars themselves, and Emma felt her breath leave her in a shaky exhale. To hear the word love spoken aloud, to hear it from him, was to feel the world shift on its axis. She had spent so long doubting, so long convincing herself that her feelings were unrequited, that this sudden clarity was almost too much to believe. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, her voice muffled but full of conviction. "You don't know how many nights I prayed you would say that." Adrian's arm tightened around her, drawing her closer until she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "Then maybe," he whispered into her hair, "the night was listening after all." And in that moment, with their truths finally spoken, the midnight no longer felt heavy with unspoken words but alive with a love that was finally free to breathe. The world around them seemed to shrink, as though the night itself had decided to retreat and leave only the two of them suspended in its embrace. The air was cool, yet Emma felt a warmth blooming inside her chest that spread outward, wrapping her whole being in an unfamiliar comfort. Adrian's hand never left hers, his thumb still tracing small, absent-minded circles on her skin, and with every touch, it felt as if another piece of her fear melted away. For so long, she had dreamed of this closeness, yet she had convinced herself it was nothing more than a fantasy that belonged to lonely nights and fragile hopes. Now, the reality of his nearness, the strength in his presence, made it impossible to deny that her heart had finally found its answer. She tilted her head up, her eyes meeting his again, and in the stillness between them, 100 unsaid things passed like whispers. Adrian's gaze was steady, tender, but it carried an intensity that sent shivers racing down her spine. He leaned closer, not hurriedly, but with a kind of reverence, as though every inch between them was sacred ground. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he could hear it. When his forehead brushed gently against hers, the world fell into silence, as if even the stars held their breath. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let down every wall she had built to protect her heart. Adrian's other hand came up slowly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek as though memorizing the feel of her skin. "Emma," he whispered, her name carrying the weight of every unspoken promise, "you are the part of my life I didn't know I was missing, until you." The confession sank into her like warmth after a long winter, and tears stung her eyes again, not of pain, but of overwhelming joy. She let out a shaky laugh, pressing her hand against his chest where his heartbeat thundered beneath her palm. "You make it sound so easy," she murmured, her voice trembling with affection, "but do you realize how long I've carried this? How many times I wanted to reach for you and stopped myself?" Adrian closed the space between them completely, pulling her into his arms, and as she melted against him, she realized that her waiting had not been in vain. His embrace was strong yet gentle, steady yet tender, like a harbor she could finally rest in after years of drifting. She buried her face against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him that now felt like home. "Every moment we didn't speak," Adrian said softly, his lips close to her ear, "I still felt you with me. Every day I held back, it wasn't because I didn't want you, it was because I wanted you too much, and I didn't trust myself to keep it hidden if I said it aloud." Emma tightened her arms around him, overwhelmed by the truth of his words. All the nights she had spent wondering if she was invisible to him, all the doubts that had kept her awake, dissolved under the weight of his embrace. She leaned back slightly to look at him, her fingers brushing against his jawline as though confirming that he was real and not just a dream conjured by her longing. His eyes shone with something deeper than desire, something steady, unwavering, something that felt like forever. "Then don't hide anymore," she whispered, her lips trembling, "not from me." The space between them vanished in an instant as Adrian pulled her closer, their bodies pressed together in a closeness that felt inevitable. Emma's heart raced, but not with fear, only with the exhilaration of finally touching what she had longed for. He rested his cheek against her hair, breathing her in as though trying to etch this moment into his very soul. "No more hiding," he promised, his voice firm yet tender. And as they held onto each other under the vast canopy of stars, Emma realized that this was no longer the fragile dream she had clung to in silence. This was real, solid, alive, a love born not of fleeting passion, but of countless unspoken nights finally given voice in one midnight embrace. The embrace lingered, and in that closeness, Emma felt as though time itself had stilled. The garden, the night, the distant hum of the world, all of it faded until only Adrian's heartbeat and the warmth of his arms existed. She pulled back just slightly, enough to meet his gaze, and in the quiet intensity of his eyes, she saw not only desire but devotion, something deeper than she had ever dared to hope for. For a moment, words felt unnecessary. The silence between them was its own language, and yet her heart whispered for more, for the kind of closeness that erased doubt, that sealed their unspoken promises. Adrian's hand rose to cradle her face, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheek as though her skin were something too delicate for this world. His gaze flickered from her eyes to her lips, and Emma's breath caught, her chest rising and falling with the weight of anticipation. She didn't move away. She didn't need to. Instead, she tilted her chin ever so slightly, an unspoken invitation that he answered without hesitation. When his lips met hers, the world seemed to collapse into a single, breathtaking moment. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if both were testing the reality of it, afraid it might vanish like a fragile dream. But then, as if a dam had broken, the tenderness deepened into something more consuming, more urgent, a fire that had waited too long to burn. Emma's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, holding him as though afraid he might disappear, while Adrian's arm tightened around her waist, anchoring her firmly to him. The taste of his kiss was both unfamiliar and achingly familiar, like something she had been missing without realizing it. Every second of it felt like both a beginning and a culmination, the answer to every question her heart had ever asked in silence. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, their foreheads remained pressed together, both unwilling to break the fragile thread of connection between them. "I've imagined that moment 1,000 times," Adrian whispered, his breath still uneven, "but nothing compares to this." Emma laughed softly, a sound laced with both joy and disbelief, as though she couldn't quite comprehend that the kiss had been real. "If this is a dream," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't ever want to wake up." Adrian's smile was tender, but behind it was a fierceness, a resolve that had never been there before. "This isn't a dream," he promised, brushing his lips lightly against hers again, "and I'm not going to let it be just a moment. I want every tomorrow with you, Emma." Her chest tightened at his words, the sincerity in them pulling tears once more to her eyes. She had spent so long imagining love as something fragile, fleeting, too fragile to hold, and now here it was solid, certain, standing before her in the man who held her as though she was his entire world. They sat back on the bench, still close, still unwilling to let go of each other's hands. The night stretched around them, vast and endless, but instead of feeling small within it, they felt infinite. Adrian spoke of the future, not in grand plans or impossible promises, but in gentle hopes. "I want to walk with you through mornings as soft as this night," he said, "to laugh with you in crowded streets, to grow old still looking at you like this." Emma listened, her heart swelling with each word, and when he paused, she answered with her own quiet dreams. "I want to share every sunrise and every storm. I want to know what it feels like to build a life not alone, but with you." Their voices wove together, a tapestry of longing and promise, until it was no longer about confessions or fears but about building something real, something lasting. The stars above seemed to glow brighter, as if blessing their newfound love, and the moonlight wrapped them in its silver glow like a witness to their vows. The kiss had sealed what their hearts had always known, and as they leaned against each other, hands entwined, Emma realized that love was not a fleeting spark but a steady flame, one that could light the darkest nights. For the first time in years, she felt not only alive but complete. And as Adrian pressed a final kiss against her temple, whispering her name like a sacred prayer, she knew with absolute certainty that this midnight talk was not the end of a longing story, but the beginning of a love that would outlast even the stars. The night was slipping gently toward dawn, though neither Emma nor Adrian seemed to notice at first. Time had become something irrelevant, a distant rhythm that no longer governed their hearts. The garden around them had grown quieter still, the crickets fading into silence as if even nature itself wished to honor the moment they shared. Emma leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her fingers still woven tightly through his. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, the reassuring warmth of his presence, and for the first time in her life, she felt no need to rush, no pressing urgency to fill the silence with words. Everything she had longed for was here, in the way his thumb moved absent-mindedly against the back of her hand, in the weight of his gaze when she dared to look up at him, in the way he seemed to hold her as though he had finally found what he had been searching for all his life. Yet, beneath the comfort, there was a trembling awareness that the night could not last forever. The stars would fade, the moon would give way to morning, and the magic of midnight would slip into memory. But what comforted her was the realization that their love did not belong to the night alone, it had simply been born here, under the silver glow of the sky. Adrian sensed her thoughts before she spoke them. He shifted slightly, turning so he could study her face, his eyes soft but searching. "You're afraid this will disappear with the dawn," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Emma swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm afraid of waking up and finding it was only a dream," she admitted honestly. Adrian's lips curved into a gentle smile, and he pressed a kiss to her forehead with a tenderness that nearly unraveled her. "This is no dream, Emma. If the morning tries to take this from us, then I'll remind you every single day that this is real. Tonight was just the beginning." His words sank into her like sunlight after rain, warming every fragile part of her that had once doubted love could be this true. She believed him not because he had spoken them so earnestly, but because everything about him radiated a truth she could feel deep in her bones. They rose from the bench, reluctant yet knowing they could not sit there forever. The world around them was beginning to shift, the horizon hinted at the faintest traces of light, a whisper of dawn brushing against the dark canvas of the sky. Adrian kept her hand firmly in his as they walked along the gravel path, their footsteps slow, as though dragging out each second they had left of the night. Emma glanced at him, memorizing the way the soft moonlight touched his features, the strength in his shoulders, the tenderness in his eyes. "You've changed everything," she said quietly, her voice almost lost to the breeze. Adrian turned toward her, stopping in his tracks, his gaze locking with hers. "No," he corrected softly, "you've given me everything. You've turned a life I thought was enough into something extraordinary." She felt tears sting her eyes again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. Instead, she let them fall, and Adrian kissed them away, one by one, until all that remained on her face was the glow of love. As they reached the gate of the garden, Emma hesitated, unwilling to let the night slip away entirely. Adrian noticed, his hand tightening around hers. "This isn't goodbye," he promised, his voice firm yet filled with tenderness. "This is good night, and tomorrow, it will be good morning. And after that, every day we'll have together." His words were simple, but to Emma, they were everything. She nodded, unable to find her voice, and leaned into him once more. His arms encircled her, holding her in an embrace that felt timeless, as if it could carry her through every sunrise, every storm, every uncertainty. The world beyond the garden waited for them, full of challenges and unknowns, but here, in his arms, she felt invincible. The first rays of dawn began to stretch across the sky, painting it with shades of gold and rose. The stars slowly dimmed, retreating into the brightness of morning, but Emma no longer feared their fading. She had spent years believing love was fragile, something to be whispered in shadows and carried in secret, but tonight had shown her that love could be vast, radiant, unbreakable. As Adrian kissed her once more, this time slow and lingering, Emma knew that what had begun as a midnight talk had transformed into something eternal. Love was no longer a distant hope, it was here, alive, beating within her chest and reflected back in the eyes of the man who held her. And as the sun finally rose, spilling light over the world, Emma and Adrian stepped into the day not as two souls bound by silence, but as lovers whose hearts had finally spoken. Midnight had given them its gift, and the dawn promised them forever.